Hello, welcome. My name is Peter Antoni and I'm the local partner of Viking cruises here in Berlin. And what I want to do is to show you the different facets of Berlin over the next couple of minutes. The city that I was born in and grew up with, West Berlin, basically doesn't exist anymore. After 1989, what used to be West and East Berlin, the western and the eastern part of the Cold War, became one city. So quite a lot of change has happened over the last 30 years since the wall came down, more than 30 years already. And we still use the terms East and West, but only in a geographical meaning, not in a political meaning, with a political meaning anymore. And Berlin is not a very old city. That's probably the first fact that you need to understand. It's only 800 years old. So for European standards or German standards, it's a fairly young city. But of course, the last 200 or 300 years, Berlin had a very turbulent, interesting, vibrant history. And that's exactly what we will show you in the video about Berlin. And this is the area where I live, which is in the southwestern part of Berlin, in a district called Zehlendorf. And Zehlendorf used to be part of the American sector in East-West time, so in West Berlin, of course. So, and there are traces of history connected to the Berlin past basically everywhere. And one is just across the street from where I live, the school, and this is where we will go. And I explain more about this building in a minute. Here we stand in front of that building that I just showed you, and that building, which dates from 1905, is a school. And that school was just recently renamed, and it now carries the name Gail Halvorsen. I don't know how many of you have heard of Gail Halvorsen before, but here in Berlin, especially in former West Berlin, he is quite a famous figure because he was one of those pilots who brought in food and supply during the Berlin Airlift. The Berlin Airlift took place between 1948 and 49, because at that time, after World War II, when Germany was divided into East Germany and West Germany, and West Berlin in the middle of East Germany belonged politically to West Germany. So the Russians didn't like the idea of the Soviets at that time, so they wanted to make sure that sooner or later West Berlin will become a part of East Germany. So in order to achieve that, what they did, they actually cut off all ties, all streets, canals, train connections. So everything that connected West Berlin to the West was stopped and sealed and disconnected. And what then happened is that mostly the Americans, but the Allied troops in general, supplied West Berlin for almost 1 year only by air. So every day, day and night, 24/7, minute after minute, planes came in and brought food, provisions, coal, basically everything a city of more than 2 million people needed at that time. There was quite a logistical masterpiece at that time. And one of the pilots from that time is Gail Halvorsen. And he was the one who actually started the idea that the pilots should not only bring the official supply, but also carry some sweets and candy and chocolate for the Berlin kids from that time. So, and because of that, and really he came to Berlin very often afterwards, and I told the story how it all started. But that was a big thing because, as you can imagine, after 45, Berlin, both parts of Berlin were still destroyed, damaged. There were really living conditions were not very nice. So for the kids, it was a big thing that there was candy and chocolate brought to them by American pilots. And my mother actually can still remember that. So she was born in 1940, so she was 8-9 years old at that time. And she can still remember being at Tempelhof Airport at the fence waiting for the pilots to bring those candies to her. And she actually kept here one of the wrappings for many years afterwards, because it was the first time in her life that she actually had chocolate. Yes, and this is what you find very often in Berlin, that there always, wherever you go, there's always a connection to something from 50 years, 70 years, 200 years ago, and very interesting. So it's not only the historical center of Berlin, which we will also visit, but also the suburbs that carry quite a lot of interesting history. So, hello, this is the Gendarmenmarkt square right in the very center of Berlin. The historical center of Berlin, I have to say, because as you know, Berlin was always a fairly spread out city, and it was then after the war divided into East and West Berlin. And over here that was then East Berlin, but East Berlin or former East Berlin is the historical center. So most of the old historical buildings are all here. And right here on this very nice square, beautiful square, we have a couple of interesting buildings. There is the Schauspielhaus, which is one of the several concert halls that Berlin has. It is obviously one of the older ones. It dates back from the early 19th century. But this is only a building, it was built by Schinkel, who is a famous Berlin architect, and was built, we will see more of Schinkel over the next couple of minutes. But Schinkel built this one, but there was a concert hall and opera house here before, but that was destroyed, burned down in the 18th century, and then in the early 19th century, in 1818, a new one was built. So, and this is now home of one of the Berlin Philharmonic Orchestras, not the famous Berlin Philharmonic Orchestra, but one of them. And then there are two identical churches here, cathedrals. One is the French church, French cathedral, and the other one just behind me is the German cathedral. And both are Protestant, and they were built actually also in the 18th century, and it's basically a symbolic building. There are these two churches behind the towers, but the towers are identical, and it was to show the equality between the German and the French, because at that time a lot of the Berlin population, a high number of people were French origin. Those were refugees who left Catholic France and came to Germany in the early 18th century because they felt that this was a place, the emperor or the king of Prussia basically granted religious freedom, which was very rare at this time in Europe. So many people from other countries came here to find shelter, very often Jewish people from the East, but also Catholics from France. And in order to show that those two people worked well together, those two identical churches were built here. And there are still active churches to a certain degree, but there are also exhibitions inside in the German church and the larger building. There's the Museum of German History, which is very interesting. So here we are, not far from Gendarmenmarkt Square is the Platz, Bebel Square, named after a famous social democratic politician, but it used to be called the Platz. And as you can see, also quite a lot of big, impressive buildings here situated on that square, and the most important one is actually the pinkish building here to the right. That is the State Opera Berlin. The State Opera is one of 3 opera houses in Berlin. There's also the comic opera and the German opera, but this is the real deal. So this is the important old historical opera house of Berlin. And it's actually situated on the Unter den Linden Boulevard, which is quite a nice big boulevard starting at the Brandenburg Gate and then leading all the way to the city palace of the royal Prussian family that we will also visit here during our Berlin excursion and see. And that's also a very interesting building that underwent lots of changes throughout history. But what you see on the other side of the street here is the Humboldt University. And again, long story, 3 universities in Berlin, but this is also due to the nature that this is the historical center of Berlin. So that was the first university to be built here, and it's now still one of the most important ones. Not the largest, definitely not, but in terms of prestige, it is the best in Berlin right now. Nice as this square is, and I told you there are many nice squares here in Berlin, but a lot of them also have the burden of history. And here on this particular square you also find the good and the bad of German history. So there is the Humboldt University, where people like Albert Einstein or the Humboldt brothers went to university or were teaching there. And then there's the State Opera. There is the Hedwig Cathedral, one of the most important Catholic churches under renovation right now, but lots of pretty buildings. But this square also has a dark history, and what happened over here, if you come here and follow me, then you will see there is this little glass window, and that glass window goes into the basement, and there you see empty bookshelves, and that is of course a memorial. And the memorial goes back to the time of the Nazi time in 1933. On May the 10th, this infamous book burning took place here in Berlin, because that building here behind me, part of the Humboldt University, was the library at that time. So there were all the Nazis came and basically took all the books from authors that they didn't like, who were Jewish or left communists or had an ideology that they didn't share, and started to burn them right here on that square. And that was basically the first sign. Until then, many people still believed that the Nazis were, yes, they were not the nicest people, but only then people realized really the nature of their ideology and how bad they actually were. But the first sign was that Nazi book burning in May 1933, right here on that square. So here on Unter den Linden, there are, as I already explained, a couple of very important, significant buildings, Prussian history at its best. The State Opera on this side, and here one of the many Prussian palais that used to be, there was the residence of one of the Prussian kings and princes. They used to have various palais here on Unter den Linden, and now many of these buildings have been transformed into museums, exhibition halls, concert venues, or museums basically. And over here it's a rather modern place. It's sponsored by Deutsche Bank, and they do all kinds of fairly funky, innovative, modern art exhibitions. And you can already see that here by the sculpture in front of that old building, what kind of style they do or show inside this building. Back behind me you see the television tower, which is a building from the 60s here, what was built by the East German government, also as a prestigious building right in the center of Berlin. This part of Berlin, Alexanderplatz, was heavily damaged and destroyed in World War II. So this famous street here, Unter den Linden, with all these important buildings of Prussian history, led all the way directly to Alexanderplatz. Buildings were damaged here too, but very often not completely destroyed, and then later on rebuilt, renovated. But over there at Alexanderplatz, it's really rather new and modern and completely different. But here you already see a bit what is the fascination of Berlin, this mix of old and new, of different architecture styles, and it's all very close next to each other. So here we are at the Humboldt Forum, or what used to be the city palace of the royal family of Prussia, the Hohenzollern. So from the 15th century all the way to 1918, the end of the monarchy here in Germany, this was the main residence of the Hohenzollern family. A building that dates back from the 16th, 17th and 18th century. It was built in various stages. But what you see behind me was basically completely damaged and destroyed during World War II, and then teared down by the East Germans. It then became the seat of the East German Parliament. Then after the unification of Germany, it was decided that this building, then the East German Parliament, will be abolished and disappear. And then a few years later again, the government decided to basically rebuild the old city palace. But we will see it in a couple of seconds. It's not a complete replica of the old ones. They are very interesting modern elements. And one facade, one side, one of the four sides of the city palace is actually completely new and modern architecture. But there are also certain elements, especially from the outside, that are old. And it houses a couple of museums now. So the way how it works today is that it really is a big cultural center, basically, similar to the Centre Pompidou in Paris. So museums, changing exhibitions, concert venues inside, so all kinds of activities is taking place inside, and we will take a closer look of it. So here we are inside the Humboldt Forum, and as I already explained, there are various forms of architecture. There's an exact rebuild of the old style, but there's also modern interpretations, very often the same color or same proportion of glass to stone, but of course still a modern building. And then you can see inside this Schlüterhof, named after the architect who built the main portion of the palace, that there are various rooms. So for example, here there is a sculpture hall where some of the old sculptures are exhibited, because many of them are somehow should be protected from environmental damages. So what you see here on the top very often are replicas, are not the original sculptures. Those are very often inside the building, so that you can see inside the halls. But over here, and various rooms, places, restaurants, shops of course, but also a museum, history of the site that basically explained what happened here, because as so often in German history, throughout turbulent history, many things happened, good and bad, and all this can be seen here inside this museum complex as well. And here we have the Humboldt Forum, still same building, another side, and I already told you there are 4 sides to the building, of course, it's a square building, and 3 of them are in historical style, and now we will see the third side, which is facing to the east and is close to the Spree River. And here we have a very modern interpretation of the building, and of course this is the controversial part of it. There are many people who like the idea that this building, that was basically part of old Berlin for centuries, was rebuilt. But the problem was this side. This is actually the side where the original palace was started. But over the centuries, the facade was changed and teared down and rebuilt and changed again. So we could not really agree on which kind of palace, which kind of facade should be built here on this side. The one from the 15th, from the 16th, 17th or 18th century. So at the end it was decided, well, let's have a modern building here. And of course now also for the museum purposes, it's much easier to have a modern building, so there's more space and it can be purposely built and designed to show the exhibits. So, and while we are already here at this particular place, Humboldt Forum, you see a big cathedral right behind me, and that is the Berlin Cathedral. And the Berlin Cathedral looks very old, but it's actually not at all. It's from 1905. So it was built in the 20th century, but it was built in this rather voluminous style that the emperor Kaiser Wilhelm liked at that style. So he wanted to have a really big, impressive Protestant church. That's what you always have to keep in mind. Germany is divided between north and south. In the south of Germany it's mostly Catholic, in the north it's mostly Protestant. So Prussia was a very Protestant country. So of course the Kaiser wanted to have big, impressive Protestant churches or cathedrals, and this one is actually the biggest one by size in continental Europe here, but it's not that old, and this is also where many of the Prussian kings and queens are buried, right there in the cellar of that Berlin Cathedral. And the Humboldt Forum is located basically next to the museum island. Berlin has this island where the Spree is divided for a couple of 100 meters, and there's an island, and on this island there are 5 museums. Among them, for example, the Pergamon Museum, but also the old National Gallery. What you see in the back behind me, which looks a little bit like a Greek temple, that is the old National Gallery on the Museum Island, which we will also visit. Now we are on Museum Island, and behind me is the Altes Museum, the Old Museum, also built by Friedrich Schinkel, Karl Friedrich Schinkel, and completed in 1830. So there was still a time when there was no German Empire. That was only founded in 1871, but there was still Prussia at that time. So the person who paid for it was the then King of Prussia. And the Museum Island is part of the UNESCO World Heritage. It's 5 museums here, and the one behind me, the Old Museum, houses the Antiquity collection. But there's also the famous Pergamon Museum and the New Museum, which houses the famous Nefertiti and Egyptian art. Lots of interesting buildings, and if you take a look here, then you will see the Berlin Cathedral, the big Protestant church, and over there the Humboldt Forum, the old, what used to be the Royal Palace, Prussian Palace, City Palace, and was just recently opened and completely rebuilt. And here we are still on Unter den Linden and the historical center of Berlin. This is the entrance, the main entrance to some of the museums of Museum Islands. Those 5 museums, they have their own individual entrances, but the central entrance for the entire complex is here, the so-called James Simon Gallery. And that's, you can see, it's a modern building. It's just opened a few years ago. It's named after a Berlin sponsor. James Simon was a Berlin merchant, and he was actually the one who financed the expedition to Egypt. And at the end of the day, those were the ones who then discovered the Nefertiti bust and brought it to Berlin. And he was Jewish, so he was also disgraced during the Nazi time. Became completely, forgotten, but for many, many years nobody knew about his fate anymore. And now also to give back basically honor to whom what he deserves, this place was called after him, named after him, James Simon Gallery. So this is the one side of the James Simon Gallery, and as you can see, there's even a little landing pier for excursion boats. So you can enter the Museum Island by boat and then go up the steps and enter from here. And next to the James Simon Gallery is the Pergamon Museum, which is currently completely rebuilt. So it will be closed for a few more years, or partly closed. Some exhibits can be seen, but the most part of the museum is currently closed because it's quite a big undertaking to rebuild this museum again. And over here you can see again what makes Berlin so special. We have fairly modern architecture, which is a gallery here, the Haus Bastian, and next to it is a building where you can still see the bullet holes from World War II. Sometimes it still hasn't been discovered actually or decided who is the owner of the building, and very often until then nothing happened. So very often many of the buildings here had Jewish ownership, and then the buildings were confiscated during the Nazi time. Then the East Germans after 45, the communists took it away, gave it to somebody else. Those people don't exist anymore. So very often it's quite complicated to figure out who owns what. And in the meantime, those buildings are just left standing and nothing happens. And here is a typical example. And if you look over there, those old buildings in the background, the third building, which is right in the middle behind that yellow one, or behind the orange one, this is where Angela Merkel lives. So she's not the chancellor anymore. So, I mean, she decided after 16 years not to act as chancellor anymore. But she still lives there. This is her apartment over there, right across the canal and street from Pergamon Museum. So here on Museum Island there are also various different things happening all the time. So behind me you see an art market that only takes place on weekends, Saturdays and Sunday, and it's not high art, it's more like a flea market. Nevertheless, it is nice, and on a sunny day, on a busy weekend, which is right not, it's not sunny and it's not busy in Berlin at this time of the year. So, but normally this is a really nice place to come and to do some shopping and little paintings and pictures and stuff. So you can buy all this here. So we are now in a district of Berlin called Kreuzberg. And Kreuzberg in many ways has completely intact survived World War II. And this is how big parts of Berlin looked at that time. That architecture or those buildings are not that old. Most of them were built between 1880 and 1900. There was the time when Berlin grew very rapidly. There was no German Empire or no unified Germany until 1871. So, and Berlin was always the capital of Prussia, but there were other German kingdoms like Silesia and Saxony and Bavaria. And only in 1871 there was a united Germany, and basically Prussia, as the most dominant state, then forced the other German kingdoms to join a Prussian-dominated empire. So Berlin, as capital of Prussia, became the capital of Germany. The Prussian king became the emperor of Germany, and the Prussian chancellor Bismarck became the first chancellor of Germany. And that was the time, of course, also the industrialization of Europe and Germany. And when Berlin became the capital, then the city grew, and there was a lot of city grew rapidly, and many villages then were incorporated and integrated into the city. But this is a very historical part of it, and nothing has changed. Most of these buildings were renovated over the last 10, 20, 30 years. You still have cobblestones, you have little squares, you have little markets taking place. So this is also everyday life Berlin. So it's not just a big city, big streets. Berlin has 4 million inhabitants, but it's really just also different districts and all sub-centers with their own life. Behind me is the Jewish Museum. The Jewish Museum is very, very, very interesting. It's not that old, probably 20 years, but it's the architecture itself. It's not only the displays inside showing the life of Jews in Germany over the last 2,000 years, with a special focus, of course, of the horrible Nazi time, but also many other interesting aspects. But the building, this is the old wing, and then there's a new wing, and the new wing will have a closer look at it. Fantastic architecture. So this is the modern part of the Jewish Museum. It was actually designed by the Polish-American architect Daniel Libeskind. And Daniel Libeskind is also famous, of course, for building the Freedom Tower, what used to be the World Trade Center on that side. He's the architect of that famous building. But here there was the first museums building that he designed, and he won several prizes for it, and since then has been awarded many other museum projects. And the building itself, if you look at it from above, it looks like a broken Star of David. It's full of symbolic architecture inside, very moving, very interesting. Can highly recommend it whenever you're in Berlin. Have a look at this museum, it's special. We are at Potsdamer Platz, and Potsdamer Platz was the busiest square in pre-war Berlin. And this is where the first traffic light of Europe was actually built. So today it's a replica of it. It has only symbolic meaning. Of course, it doesn't show the lights anymore, but this is how it looked. And this is where you can see that Berlin was completely, or big parts of Berlin were completely destroyed during World War II. Not a single old building is left here. And this was really where the last fights took place during World War II. Hitler's bunker is just 500 meters from here. And then Potsdamer Platz basically became a dead end. We are standing now right on the area where the wall used to be. So you can still see here some of the old wall pieces that divided East and West Berlin. So further down is Brandenburg Gate, and here we are, so it was East Berlin on this side and West Berlin right behind me. but this was border area, so on both sides basically it was empty wasteland. There were watchtowers and mines and guards and docks, and it was an empty space guarded the border between East and West Berlin. The wall was erected in 1961 and then of course in 1989 fell down. But basically politically Berlin was divided after 45, after World War II, into East, the Russian Soviet sector, and the West, American, French, British sector. And here it all came together. And ever since the wall came down, this has been rebuilt as the old new center again. So you can see office buildings, a big train station, Potsdamer Platz right behind me, hotels, shopping centers, restaurants, it's all here. But in 1988 it looked completely different, it was empty. Just an amazing piece of history again here. But this is what makes Berlin so special, this constant change of old and new and east and west and historical and modern, and here you can see it perfectly.